It was a quiet evening in the city. The streets were not too crowded, and most people were either at home or finishing up their day. The air was cool, and the traffic lights blinked in their usual rhythm, guiding cars smoothly through the roads. A black sit-in moved at a steady pace down a well-lit street. The driver, a middle-aged black man, sat behind the wheel, focused on the road. He had just finished a long day at work and was heading home. His face showed no signs of stress. He was used to long hours and late nights. It was part of his job. As he passed through an intersection, he noticed flashing red and blue lights in his rearview mirror. A police car was following him. Within seconds, the siren blared, signaling him to pull over. He sighed, keeping his hands firmly on the wheel. He wasn't speeding, and he knew for a fact that his car was in perfect condition. Still, he turned on his right indicator and slowly pulled over to the side of the road. Inside the police car, two officers exchanged glances. One of them, the senior officer, smirked slightly. "Let's see what we got here," he muttered as they stepped out. They approached the sit-in with slow, measured steps, their flashlights pointing at the driver's side window. The driver rolled down his window, his expression calm but firm. "Good evening, officers," he said in a polite tone. The younger officer stepped closer, scanning the inside of the car with a sharp gaze. "License and registration," he demanded. The driver nodded, moving his hand slowly toward his glove compartment. "I'm reaching for my registration," he said clearly, making sure they saw every movement. He knew how these situations could go wrong, even when a person did everything right. As he handed over his documents, the senior officer narrowed his eyes at the name printed on the license. Something about the name sounded familiar, but he didn't think much of it. He looked back at the driver. "Do you live around here?" The driver nodded. "Yes, officer." The younger cop, still suspicious, walked around the car, shining his flashlight along the sides. "Where are you coming from?" he asked, his voice firm. "From work," the driver answered. His voice was steady, giving away no frustration. The senior officer pursed his lips. "Work, huh? And what kind of work do you do?" The driver took a small breath, sensing the unnecessary tension in the air. "I work for the state," he replied simply. The officers exchanged glances again. The younger one folded his arms, mine stepping out of the car. The driver's fingers tightened slightly around the steering wheel. "May I ask why?" he questioned, his voice still calm. The senior officer's expression didn't change. "Just a routine check." The driver knew there was nothing routine about this, but he also knew arguing on the side of the road wouldn't help. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out slowly, keeping his hands visible. The officers watched him closely. The younger officer suddenly reached forward and turned the driver around, pressing him against the car. "Just checking for weapons," he said casually as he patted him down. The driver let out a slow breath, holding back his irritation. He had been in courtrooms where these kinds of stops were discussed. He had seen the statistics, and now, here he was, experiencing it firsthand. The senior officer looked at his partner and gave a small nod. "Cuff him." The driver closed his eyes for a brief second. This was getting worse by the second. As the cold metal tightened around his wrists, he calmly said, "You might want to check my ID again before this goes any further." The man stood still, his hands secured behind his back with the cold steel of the handcuffs. The flashing red and blue lights reflected off the dark surface of his car, casting long shadows onto the quiet street. The two officers exchanged satisfied glances, believing they had done their job well. The younger officer tightened his grip on the man's arm and began leading him toward the police car. "You fit the description," he muttered under his breath, though he never mentioned what description that was. The man didn't resist. He remained calm, his face unreadable. As they walked, the senior officer held up the man's license, glancing at it again under the streetlight. The name was there, bold and clear, but he still didn't make the connection. To him, This was just another routine arrest. Nothing unusual, nothing worth questioning. The man, however, knew exactly what was happening. He had seen cases like this in the courtroom too many times. He had read reports, seen body cam footage, and heard countless testimonies from people who had gone through similar experiences. But he never thought he would be in this position himself. He took a deep breath and spoke in a calm, steady voice. "Officers, I'll ask again. Are you sure you want to go through with this?" The younger officer scoffed. "Yeah, we're sure." He opened the door of the police car and motioned for the man to sit inside. "Get in." For a moment, the man didn't move. He turned his head slightly, looking at the officers with patience rather than anger. "You might regret this," he said, his voice still controlled, as if he already knew something they didn't. The senior officer chuckled. "Regret what?" "Doing our job." He shook his head and smirked. "You should be worried about yourself, not us." The man sighed but didn't argue. He carefully lowered himself into the back seat, the cuffs pressing against his wrists as he leaned back. The door shut firmly behind him. The younger officer sat in the driver's seat, while the senior officer took one last look at the car before getting in as well. The police car pulled away from the curb, driving through the city streets toward the station. The man sat quietly in the back, watching the city lights pass by through the window. He had spent years working in this city, dedicating his career to upholding justice. And now, here he was, treated like a suspect for no reason at all. The younger officer glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "So, what do you do for the state?" he asked with a smirk. The man tilted his head slightly. "You'll find out soon enough." The officer scoffed, shaking his head. "Yeah, sure." The car finally pulled into the police station parking lot. The officers stepped out first, then opened the back door, pulling the man out with them. He didn't struggle or resist. He simply walked with them, his posture upright, his expression still unreadable. As they entered the station, the booking officer at the front desk barely looked up at first. He was busy writing something down, preparing to log another routine arrest. "Name?" he asked without looking. The senior officer handed over the man's ID. "Got him for suspicious activity. We'll run his record." But before he could finish, the booking officer finally looked at the name on the ID. His pen stopped moving. His eyes widened slightly, and he glanced up at the man standing in front of him. A flash of recognition crossed his face. The room went silent. The booking officer swallowed hard and quickly looked at the two officers. His voice was suddenly careful, almost hesitant. Do you know who this is?" The officers frowned. "What do you mean?" the younger one asked, confused. The booking officer turned the ID around, showing them the name. "This is the state's chief prosecutor." For the first time since the arrest, the two officers felt their confidence crack. They looked at the man, their expressions shifting from certainty to disbelief. The man met their eyes, his expression calm as ever. "Now," he said, "do you still think you were just doing your job?" The air in the police station suddenly felt heavy. The two officers, who had been so sure of themselves just moments ago, now stood frozen. The words of the booking officer echoed in their heads. "State's chief prosecutor." The younger officer blinked in confusion, his mouth opening slightly as if he wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. The senior officer's jaw tightened. He looked at the ID in his hand again, this time really reading the name. And then it hit him. He had seen this name before, on news reports, in court cases, even in legal documents. The man standing in front of them wasn't just anybody. He was the highest-ranking prosecutor in the state, the very person responsible for ensuring that justice was served. And they had just arrested him without cause. The booking officer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Sir," he said carefully, looking directly at the chief prosecutor, "I assume there's been some kind of misunderstanding." The chief prosecutor remained calm, though there was a sharpness in his gaze. "A misunderstanding," he repeated, his voice smooth but firm. He turned slightly toward the two officers. That's an interesting choice of words. The younger officer swallowed hard. His confidence from earlier was gone. He suddenly felt like he was shrinking under the prosecutor's steady stare. The senior officer took a deep breath and forced a smile. "Look, sir, maybe we got off on the wrong foot. We were just—" The chief prosecutor raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Before you say anything else, I want to be very clear," he said. "I followed every instruction you gave. I provided my license and registration immediately. I remained calm and cooperative. And yet you still arrested me." Neither officer spoke. The chief prosecutor took a slow step forward. "Tell me, at what point did I become a suspect? Was it when I said I lived in the neighborhood? Or was it simply when you saw who I was?" The younger officer looked down, his hands tightening at his sides. The senior officer tried to hold his ground, but his confidence was fading fast. The booking officer cleared his throat. "Sir, do you want to press charges?" The chief prosecutor glanced at him. "That depends. Are the body cameras on?" The booking officer nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. All footage is automatically saved." The chief prosecutor turned back to the two officers. "Good, because I'll need that footage for my complaint." The senior officer took a small step forward, his tone suddenly more desperate. "Sir, let's not be hasty. Maybe we can talk this out." The chief prosecutor's gaze didn't waver. "Talk it out," he repeated. "Did you offer me that option when you pulled me over, or when you cuffed me?" He let the silence stretch for a moment before continuing. "No, you assumed, without reason, that I was a threat. You treated me like a criminal when I had done nothing wrong. And now that you know who I am, you want to talk." The senior officer opened his mouth but had no response. The younger officer, his face now pale, finally spoke. "Sir, we didn't know." His voice was quiet, almost pleading. The chief prosecutor nodded. "That's exactly the problem." He turned to the booking officer. "I'd like Internal Affairs notified immediately. And I want a copy of that body cam footage." The booking officer nodded quickly and picked up the phone. The two officers stood still, their faces full of regret. The weight of their actions had finally hit them. They had arrested the one person who had the power to hold them accountable. And now, there was no escaping the consequences. The station was no longer the place of control the two officers thought it was. The air had changed. The energy in the room had shifted. Just moments ago, they had been so sure of their actions, so confident in their authority. But now, the reality of what they had done was sinking in. The booking officer was already on the phone, speaking in a low but urgent tone. The chief prosecutor stood tall, his expression calm yet unshakable. He had no anger in his voice, no raised tone, but his words carried more weight than anything the officers had heard before. The senior officer cleared his throat and took a step closer, lowering his voice. "Sir, I think we can sort this out without getting anyone else involved." The chief prosecutor didn't even flinch. He simply turned his head slightly and looked at the officer with sharp, knowing eyes. "Sort this out," he repeated, "without getting anyone else involved." His voice remained steady, but the message was clear. He wasn't going to let this go. The younger officer finally spoke, his voice careful. "Sir, we really didn't know who you were. If we had known." The chief prosecutor held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "That's the issue," he said. "You're not supposed to treat people differently based on who they are. If I were someone else, would this night have ended differently? Would you have even questioned your actions?" The younger officer looked away, unable to answer. The chief prosecutor let the silence settle before continuing. "And let's be honest," he said. "It wasn't just about not knowing who I was. It was about making assumptions. You assumed something about me the moment you saw me. And that assumption led to my unlawful arrest." The senior officer sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "Sir, we were just following procedure. It was nothing personal." The chief prosecutor nodded slightly. "Procedure?" he asked. "Tell me, what part of procedure allows you to arrest someone without evidence of a crime? What part of procedure lets you ignore someone's rights? The senior officer didn't answer. He had no words left to defend himself. At that moment, the booking officer hung up the phone. He looked nervous as he cleared his throat. "Internal Affairs is on the way," he announced. His eyes flickered toward the two officers before settling on the chief prosecutor. "Sir, they'll want to speak with you first." The chief prosecutor gave a single nod. "Good." The younger officer took a deep breath and finally met the prosecutor's eyes. "Sir, I'm sorry," he said, his voice quieter than before. The chief prosecutor studied him for a moment. "An apology is a start," he said, "but it's not enough." The younger officer frowned slightly. "Then what is?" The chief prosecutor looked between the two officers. "Change," he said simply. "Real change." The sound of a door opening echoed through the station. The Internal Affairs officers had arrived. The two officers, once so confident, now stood frozen, unsure of what their future held. The chief prosecutor turned away from them, ready to tell his side of the story. The officers had made their choices. Now it was time for the consequences. The doors swung open, and 3 Internal Affairs officers stepped inside. They carried notepads and serious expressions, their eyes scanning the room quickly before settling on the chief prosecutor. The tension in the air grew heavier. The 2 officers who had made the arrest stood stiffly, their faces uncertain. They had never imagined this night would turn into something so serious. Just an hour ago, they were patrolling the streets, believing they were in control. Now they were being investigated by their own department. One of the Internal Affairs officers, a tall man with a firm voice, stepped forward. "Chief Prosecutor," he said, nodding respectfully, "we received the call. I assume you'd like to file a formal complaint." The chief prosecutor met his gaze calmly. "Yes," he said. "But before I do, I want to ensure that this case isn't treated differently just because of who I am." The officer nodded, flipping open his notepad. "We'll investigate it like any other case. Please, tell us what happened." The chief prosecutor took a deep breath, then spoke clearly. He recounted every detail, from the moment the officers pulled him over, to their refusal to explain why he was being stopped, to the way they ignored his identification and placed him in handcuffs without cause. His voice remained steady, his words direct. He had spent years building cases in the courtroom, and now he was presenting his own experience as evidence. As he spoke, the Internal Affairs officers took notes, occasionally glancing toward the 2 officers who stood silently by the wall. The younger officer had his head down, his fingers nervously gripping the edge of his belt. The senior officer, though still standing tall, no longer had the same confidence in his posture. He knew they were in trouble. When the chief prosecutor finished, the lead Internal Affairs officer turned to the booking officer. "I assume there's bodycam footage." The booking officer nodded quickly. "Yes, sir. I have access to the files." "Good. Pull it up," the officer instructed. Within moments, a computer screen flickered to life, displaying the footage from the officers' body cameras. The room fell silent as the video played. The footage showed everything exactly as the chief prosecutor had described. The way he had complied with every instruction. The way he had spoken calmly and respectfully. The way the officers had never given him a real reason for the stop. And most importantly, the moment they chose to arrest him despite having no evidence of wrongdoing. The Internal Affairs officers exchanged looks. The evidence was clear. The lead officer closed his notepad and turned to the 2 officers. "Do either of you have anything to say before we continue this investigation?" The younger officer hesitated, then stepped forward slightly. His face was pale, his voice shaky. I realize now that we made a mistake," he admitted. "We didn't handle the situation right." The senior officer clenched his jaw but remained silent. The lead Internal Affairs officer sighed, rubbing his temple. "A mistake," he repeated. "Is that what you call an unlawful arrest?" The younger officer looked down. "I know it doesn't excuse what happened, but I truly regret it." The chief prosecutor studied him for a moment before speaking. "Regret is only useful if it leads to change," he said. "If you really mean that, then ask yourself, how many others have you treated this way? How many people walked into this station, just like me, but without the power to fight back?" The younger officer swallowed hard. He had no answer. The lead internal affairs officer turned back to the chief prosecutor. "We'll move forward with the investigation," he assured him. "Both officers will be placed under review effective immediately." The chief prosecutor gave a small nod. "That's all I ask. Let the system work the way it should." The room remained silent as the reality of the situation set in. This was no longer just a simple traffic stop gone wrong. It was now an official case, one that could change the future of the two officers forever. The investigation had officially begun. The two officers who once felt powerful now stood as the ones being questioned. Their actions, which had seemed routine to them at the time, were now being carefully examined. The internal affairs officers took control of the situation. They asked the booking officer to print out a full report of the arrest, and they requested the full, unedited body camera footage. The station, usually filled with casual chatter, was now completely silent except for the sound of paperwork being shuffled and the occasional clicks from the computer. The younger officer felt a deep weight in his chest. His hands were sweating, and his throat felt dry. He kept replaying the night's events in his mind, wondering where things had gone wrong. At the time, he had thought he was just doing his job. But now, as he watched the serious faces of the internal affairs officers, he realized that he had ignored the most important part of his duty: fairness. The senior officer, however, remained still. His arms were crossed, his face tense. He wasn't ready to admit fault. To him, this was all being blown out of proportion. He had made arrests like this before without consequence, so why was this time different? The lead internal affairs officer finally looked up from his notes. "Officers, I need to ask you both a question." His voice was calm, but there was an authority in his tone that made it clear this was serious. The younger officer shifted nervously. "Yes, sir." The officer folded his hands on the desk. "Before you made the arrest, did either of you have any proof that a crime had been committed?" The room went silent. The younger officer opened his mouth, then closed it. He had no answer. The lead investigator sighed. "That's what I thought." He turned to the senior officer. "And you? Did you have any justification for putting him in handcuffs?" The senior officer's jaw tightened. "We believed he was a suspect." "In what crime?" The investigator pressed. Again, silence. The chief prosecutor, who had been standing quietly, finally spoke. "This is the exact problem," he said. "The assumption that someone is guilty before any evidence is presented." The senior officer finally looked at him. His pride was hurt, but he still tried to defend himself. "We were just being cautious." The chief prosecutor nodded slightly. "I understand the need for caution, but caution is not the same as treating someone as a criminal without reason." His voice was steady, but there was a weight behind it that made everyone listen. "And now, because of that choice, you both stand here, facing an investigation that could cost you your badges." The younger officer's breath caught in his throat. His badge, the thing he had worked so hard for, the thing he had once been so proud to wear, was he really about to lose it? The internal affairs officer looked at both men. "We're placing you both on administrative leave, effective immediately. You will turn in your badges and weapons until this investigation is complete." The senior officer's face darkened, but he didn't argue. He knew there was nothing he could say that would change the decision now. The younger officer, however, hesitated. His hand shook slightly as he unpinned his badge from his uniform. He had dreamed of becoming a police officer since he was a kid, but now that dream felt like it was slipping away. As he placed his badge on the desk, he looked up at the chief prosecutor. "Sir, if I could go back, I would do things differently." His voice was quiet, filled with regret. The chief prosecutor studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "Then prove it," he said, "not just with words, but with actions." The younger officer swallowed hard, and gave a small nod in return. He didn't know what his future held, but he knew one thing for sure. This night had changed him. The two officers left the station that night without their badges, without their weapons, and without the authority they had once taken for granted. The weight of what had happened sat heavily on their shoulders. The younger officer couldn't shake the feeling of regret. He had joined the force to serve and protect, to be someone the community could trust. But now he realized that he had failed in that duty. He had never questioned his actions before, but after tonight, he knew he had to. The senior officer, however, remained quiet. His pride had been wounded, and anger simmered beneath the surface. He didn't believe he had done anything wrong. To him, this was just an unfortunate situation that had spiraled out of control. He had seen officers get away with worse, so why was this different? Meanwhile, the chief prosecutor sat in his office the next day, reviewing the official complaint he had filed. He wasn't just doing this for himself. He was doing it for everyone who had been in his position, but didn't have the power to fight back. He knew his case would send a strong message. By the afternoon, news of the incident had spread. Reports began surfacing, questioning the officers' actions and the larger issue of fairness in law enforcement. Community leaders called for accountability, and the police department was forced to respond. A press conference was scheduled. The chief of police stood before the cameras, his face serious. "The department takes all complaints seriously," he stated firmly. "An internal investigation is underway, and we are committed to ensuring that justice is served." Watching the broadcast from home, the younger officer felt his stomach tighten. He had always believed he was a good officer, but now he wasn't so sure. He thought about the chief prosecutor's words, "Regret is only useful if it leads to change." For the first time, he saw his actions in a different light. How many times had he stopped someone just because they looked suspicious? How many times had he assumed the worst without questioning if he was truly being fair? That night, he sat down at his desk, pulled out a notebook, and started writing. Not a defense for himself, but a reflection. He listed every time he could remember making a similar mistake. Then he wrote down what he could have done differently. The senior officer, on the other hand, was not reflecting. He was angry. He believed the chief prosecutor had embarrassed them on purpose. "This is political," he muttered to himself. "They just want to make an example out of us." But deep down, a small voice in his mind whispered something different. What if we really were wrong? At the prosecutor's office, a reporter reached out for a statement. The chief prosecutor simply said, "This is not about me. This is about accountability. No one is above the law, not even those who enforce it." The words made headlines. The story gained even more attention. And now, the entire city was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. The investigation was far from over, but one thing was clear: this case would not be forgotten. The investigation continued for several weeks. Internal Affairs interviewed witnesses, reviewed body cam footage, and examined past complaints. The case had become bigger than just one incident. It was now a test of the system itself. The younger officer spent his days at home, thinking about everything that had happened. The more he reflected, the more he realized how blind he had been. He had never thought of himself as unfair, but now he could see the flaws in his thinking. He had let assumptions guide his actions instead of facts. One afternoon, he made a decision. He picked up the phone and called a mentor, an older retired officer he had always respected. "I need advice," he admitted. "I want to be better, but I don't know how to start." The mentor listened patiently, then gave him a simple answer. "You start by learning. Listen to the people you serve. Understand their experiences. And next time, when you wear that badge, make sure you use it the right way." The younger officer took the words to heart. He started attending community meetings, reading about cases where bias had played a role in policing, and even having difficult conversations with people who had lost trust in the system. He knew he couldn't erase the past, but he could choose to be different moving forward. The senior officer, however, remained distant. He avoided calls from his colleagues and refused to speak publicly about the case. He still believed he had done nothing wrong, but the pressure was growing. The department had made it clear that change was coming, whether he accepted it or not. Then, the results of the investigation were announced. At a press conference, the chief of police stood before the cameras. After a thorough review, we have concluded that the arrest of the chief prosecutor was unjustified and a violation of proper procedures. He continued, effective immediately, the senior officer involved will be dismissed from the force. The younger officer will be required to undergo additional training and will be suspended for 6 months. This is a moment for accountability, but also for learning. The news spread quickly. Some people felt the punishment should have been harsher. Others believed it was fair. But one thing was certain. This case had changed the way people looked at law enforcement. The chief prosecutor did not celebrate the outcome. He did not want revenge. He wanted change. And now, that change had begun. One evening, as he left his office, he saw the younger officer waiting outside. The officer looked nervous but determined. "I just wanted to say, thank you," the younger officer said, "for holding us accountable, for making me see what I was blind to before." The chief prosecutor studied him for a moment, then nodded. Accountability is the first step. What you do next is what really matters. The younger officer nodded. "I know," he said, "and I won't waste this second chance." As the chief prosecutor walked away, he felt a sense of hope. One case would not change everything overnight, but it was a start. Because real change wasn't just about punishment. It was about making sure mistakes weren't repeated. It was about making things better for the future.